Good evening. I'll say it again because the energy is kind of low. Good evening. You sound much better when you put energy into it. Welcome to the People's Forum again. You are the first official occupants and guests in this space, so give yourselves a round of applause. My name is Claudia de la Cruz, and I'm part of the large group of folks that help put this space together. I want to acknowledge the folks that are here that are part of that team. So if the staff is here, can you all get up and be acknowledged? Manolo, párate. We have other folks that are part of the board that are also here. So members of the board that are here, if you could get up and say hi to folks. And very important in terms of acknowledgement, we want to acknowledge and thank all the workers that put time day in and out to make this space possible. So Andy's back there, the technicians, the sound folks that have been very helpful in making us have sound tonight and for the rest of the events in the space. So we want to thank you all for being part of the team of making this happen. So thank you so much. We are very honored to have our panelists with us tonight. As you all know, the topic for tonight is building momentum and speaking about the left that is developing, that is emerging, that is growing in Europe. As someone who lives here in the United States, I feel like a lot of the times we are in isolation. And we focus a lot on national politics. And it's very good to know, particularly as capitalism has become a global force, also the global force of resistance that is being developed. And so this space is for us to be able to be in conversation with folks that are part of the development of that force of resistance in Europe. So we want to welcome Daniele Obono. Danielle is a librarian by trade, political activist. Since the early 2000s, she is now serving as the first-time member of the French National Assembly for the left political movement, La France Insoumise. Did I say that right? Okay. I speak nothing of French, but I am happy that I said it right. It translates to the untamed France. So let's give her a round of applause. We have Paul Mason, who is a British freelance journalist, writer, filmmaker, and novelist. His latest book, PostCapitalism, A Guide to Our Future, has been translated in 16 languages. So, no, that's huge. You know, it's kind of close to the Bible. So let's give Paul a welcome and applause as well. And we have Ash Sarkar, my BFF since yesterday. She is a British Indian writer, broadcaster, journalist, and lecturer living in London. She is senior editor at Novara Media, where her work focuses on race, gender, class, and power. Yes?
Yeah, that's about right.
All right. Let's give us Ash a round of applause. My task is to moderate. Hopefully I'll do that. I am a preacher by trade, so I tend to preach a lot. But I am really, really honored to be sitting amongst these folks that are, again, developing a political force that is highly important for our global work as part of the working class and the dispossessed of the world. And so we are very, very grateful to have you all here. The format of the panel will be some questions coming from the panel itself and discussion amongst panelists. And then we'll open up for discussion with you all. And so if we are cool with that, I'll ask my first question. We want to know a little bit more about you all and how you got involved in the political work that you are doing. If you could share a little bit about the political work that you are doing, that would be awesome. No specific order, you just jump in.
Go on. Okay. Is it working? Great, thanks. So I go first. First of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me tonight. It's a real pleasure and honor to be in this place with fellow socialists and communists and progressive in the US. I'm Danièle Obono. As has been said, I'm actually right now member of the French Parliament, and I started getting into activism and politics in the early 2000s. I got involved around the end of high school in the anti-globalization movement in France. That was spearheaded by organizations like ATTAC. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's an organization campaigning to for the Tobin tax and about neoliberal issues, and so I just got involved in a grassroots campaign, and in this period at the time in France was very exciting because that's when the whole European Social Forum movement started, and we went from forum to forum and meeting people from all around Europe at the time, and that was like so inspiring because for a long time left politics was discarded and despised by everybody, and that was quite kind of the rebirth of that progressive politics into a very attractive form because it was about internationalism already at that time. I remember one of the first forum I went to, we watched a movie, a film about Seattle and the mobilization in Seattle when you had I think that was the line was about the Teamster and Turtles, and we were so inspired, and we felt like we were part of this movement and the Seattle generation. So that's what got me into politics. This new wave of social movements, very inspiring, and that's where I met socialists and leftists, and it's this mix. I feel quite fortunate to have been at the same time involved in those mass movements, and also I met communists and Marxists that helped me understand more deeply the dynamics of the system, and that's about it.
Okay. So yeah, thanks all of you for coming. Thank you to the organisers for having me. I've had a really great day, like rubbernecking in the city because it's my first day here, my first time here. So I've been learning a lot, kind of on the fly, about how, race and class composition works in New York. And I've also been learning a bit about how you speak. And Claudia taught me a really great phrase yesterday, which is relevant to this question of how you got politicized, which is red diaper, baby. Yeah. Right? See, I'm now talking like one of you. So my politicization came from being a red diaper baby. My mum was anti-racist and feminist activist. She gave me a copy of Frantz Fanon's Black Skins, White Masks when I was about 12 or 13, because she wanted me to understand what it would be like to navigate life as a woman of colour. She gave me this book and I was like, oh, Mom, so much has changed. It's actually a melting pot now. Like, you see brown goths, it's a multicultural utopia. And then I lived a little more and I was like, oh my God, Mum, you were right about everything. I'm never doubting you ever again. So my coordinates really came from an awareness of the post-colonial condition. Not just the post-colonial condition of those of us living in diaspora communities, but the post-colonial condition of Britain itself. A friend of mine writes about this as in an essay where he says, like, the great trauma for Britain was that from 1945 onwards, it is getting its arse handed to it by peoples it considered racially inferior. And Britain's never gotten over it, and then you get Brexit. My political actions began, like lots of earnest 11 and 12-year-olds, with marching against the Iraq War. Later, I got a bit older as Operation Cast led, got involved with the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. But none of this added up to an economic critique. I was kind of a bit of a woolly socialist where I was like, oh, more money for more people, that's nice. But I didn't really have an understanding of capital in the same way that I had a understanding of foreign policy until I got to university. And this isn't because of anything that any of my lecturers taught me. I did English literature, so we were pretty deep into Chaucer rather than Karl Marx. It was because that when I started uni as an 18-year-old, the Conservative coalition government, along with the Liberal Democrats, and the Liberal Democrat vote had been driven very much by the young because they got elected on a platform of not increasing tuition fees, trebled tuition fees. So this felt like a great betrayal. And this was the birth of the student movement, which was really the kind of first flowering of the anti-austerity movement in the UK. We occupied our universities, we set up barricades and bonfires in the streets. We got charged at on horseback. A good friend of mine got a baton to the head and had to have brain surgery, and we lost. And we lost that fight. And it was, I think, the first moment for everyone where we realized that power is really not interested in listening to you. So nothing is going to come because you ask nicely. And around that time, there was a kind of uptick in, what you would generally call insurrectionist politics, whether that was from people that would consider themselves anti-capitalists to the riots that swept England in the summer of 2011 after police had killed a man called Mark Duggan, not that far from the area that I grew up in, which is an area which has a deep history of police violence and also rioting because of it. But the thing about insurrectionist movements is that they're really hard to sustain, right? You're in occupation all the time, or you're in squats all the time, and there's only so many chest infections you can endure before you're like, is this really the best way of doing things? And then out of nowhere comes this Bernard Cribbins-looking old fuzzy white man with who becomes leader of Her Majesty's opposition in 2015. And I was really skeptical about it. Because I had a look at Syriza and at, this kind of, history of capitulation. I thought that the Labour Party was indelibly, institutionally racist, not dispositionally racist. I mean, I'm sure they're perfectly nice to brown people and they eat samosas and all the rest of it, but institutionally racist in the sense of they conceived as politics as a terrain that had to be defended against people of colour. And I've spent the last 3 years realising that maybe I'm wrong and maybe Jeremy Corbyn is indeed the real deal. The challenge for those of us who still come from that insurrectionist background is to make sure that he doesn't get the option of capitulating on these issues of race, on these issues of immigration, on these issues of foreign policy, because we know that that's where the demand is always going to come. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about tonight.
So my name's Paul Mason, and people of my generation don't like telling their story. It's quite interesting, isn't it? But I will, because I've come to realize in a career too long to summarize even in 3 minutes, that, and I'm sure in this space there will be stories told, and the act of storytelling between oppressed people and people in struggle is one of the most powerful things that you can see them do. I'm a journalist, and so my job is to hear people's stories and tell them to other people. But to summarize mine, so if you've seen the movie Deer Hunter, yeah? Well, I come from a place like in England that it's like the place in the Deer Hunter, Clayton, Pennsylvania, but without guns, forests, deer, or Chevys. But with a lot of socialism in its culture, and so it was I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. It was a racist, sexist, hierarchical society with lots of paedophilia and wife beating, but it had prosperity, and it had solidarity, and it had a community that at its best put right some of these things. And then what happened to me in my teenage years as I saw neoliberalism begin and came into my community and smashed it apart, and really in a vindictive way with high human cost to me, my family, and everybody else. And that radicalized me. And I went to university and got involved in student politics and got involved in far left politics of a hierarchical nature. Read Marx, read Lenin, did things. We were up against a state that wanted to destroy the culture I came from, and we fought back in a hierarchical way. In the miners' strike, the print strike, the steel strike in Sheffield, which I was part of. It was like it's like a university course that you couldn't design better in class struggle, being in the north of England in the early 80s. But we lost. And in losing, it made me rethink, eventually, what my politics were. And when I was interested to hear your response to the Seattle movement, because that response for me came a little bit earlier with the Zapatista guerrilla movement, with the anti-road protests in the mid-1990s in Britain. I began to understand that the horizontalism and anti-power was actually quite powerful. So I became engaged in it. I kept as a sort of leftist and journalist, became engaged and tried to learn from it, and over the time moved into a position which would be roughly as you could roughly describe me as, if you know what these terms are, an autonomist. So I believe in autonomy, and there's this weird Italian word, post-operaism, post-workerism. That doesn't mean I don't believe workers exist, but I just see that we're living in a social factory where the capitalists exploit us through many, many different streams, even economically, our rent, our credit cards, our gym membership. It's not just work. Anyway, in the middle of all that, I became a mainstream media journalist, and quite a prominent one. I would have been on something similar to 60 Minutes as a named reporter, and reported from the Gaza war, Katrina, numerous big stories, and including the 2011 uprisings here, Zuccotti, in the streets and squares of Europe, the 2013 Turkish uprising, and the Gaza war in 2014. So, I'm a mainstream media journalist. But when Corbyn came along, I didn't necessarily think that it was going to be, I've never been part of that part of the labour movement, the British labour movement. There's quite a sort of, nostalgic for the Soviet Union type culture from which Corbynism draws on. But I did realise it was a phenomenon. And I have different cultural reference points from you than you, both in terms of generation and background. And the point is, although many people of my dad's generation, you go to a cemetery in Lee, where I come from, lots of people die of industrial illnesses and depression and related things to that, age 50-something, yeah? But a lot of people don't. So what is Labour now? I realised that what the Corbyn thing was both the revenge of your generation for the betrayal of the whole austerity thing, the collapse of the neoliberal model. And not just my generation, but people, my dad's generation, they didn't die when they were defeated. They harbored this hope for a better future, for a coming back together of the community, and they'd done nothing but storytell to each other in the pubs and clubs, and the stories go either one or two ways, as I hope we'll discuss. They either go in the way of we will reverse this, or they go in the direction of we will accept it and blame somebody for it. And that's where they sit. I'm sorry, my dad's generation, the old miners, sit in the pubs and clubs and bars using words like cockroaches about migrants. But for everyone who uses the word cockroach, there's another one using the words of socialist and Marxist propaganda. And that's where the fight is. And I was incredibly motivated to give, what I was asked by Labour to give my job up, and did, and became a freelance journalist, because you can't be a politico in the British TV. I gave my job up, became a freelance journalist, and just freelance journalism around the subject of we're going to fuck over British capitalism with this amazing mass movement that we are trying to build. That's me.
So I think it's important for us to hear a little bit more about what the current political context is from your mouths right now in Europe, particularly in Britain and France. So I know that you've been traveling a lot, Paul, and if you could share more of like the larger context, and then both Ash and Daniele share the rest.
So my neoliberalism until 2008, neoliberalism's message was it's going to be like this forever, only better. After 2008, it's going to be like this forever, only worse. That's the two-line summary of what's happened. And in the 10 years after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, I think what happened is they kept the economic model of neoliberalism alive, but you can't keep an ideology alive on life support because people's brains need coherence. And so the neoliberal elite narrative fell apart. Its institutions began to fall apart because this Labour Party, you are absolutely right, was a neoliberal institution, a defence line for capitalism. It's no longer a defence line in the same way. And what we've observed in Europe is the first thing is that what Brexit is a symptom of a wider thing, which I call neoliberalism in one country, or Thatcherism in one country. And what you observe, both with Trump, with the Brexit Tories, with this semi-fascist party in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, with the Polish government, the Law and Justice Party, you would observe the adoption of neoliberal policies at the expense of other neoliberal elites. Before, it was just collectively, they were imposing the price on all workers and all poor throughout the globe. Now they're prepared to say, in order for me to carry out my free market revolution to the next phase, rip up some more union rights, rip up some more regulations, we have to rip up some international treaties, some international law. That's my definition of what's going on in the world. And as it regards Europe, you've now got, just as you have here, but always with different national variations, plebeian right-wing movements who are pressuring the national elites to adopt nationalist free market economy. Because in 2008, we, the journalists, said, wow, capitalism nearly collapsed. What's going to happen is a return to 1930s style economic nationalism, statism. But it isn't. It's a fusion of the neoliberal model with nationalism. And what is big, I think, from our point of view in Europe, there are certain national elites that are really important, and what has happened is that some of them have flipped really sharply towards outright ethnic nationalism, and they are the Austria country, non-aligned country, very successful country, Vienna, the nicest place to live in the world. That's been voted. And yet its Conservative Party flipped overnight from being in government with the socialists to being in government with the neo-fascists. Because they wanted to. Not because somebody threatened to burn their parliament down. Likewise, the British, they are, the right wing of the Tory party has a project of xenophobic nationalism. And we could go through others. Obviously, you know, I'm really keen to hear where you think it's coming from. But I think that's the framework for me. The breakdown of the global model and its readoption at national level obliges these national elites to think, what's more important to me? My membership of the kind of whatever the liberal democratic private members club is here in Manhattan, where I can meet lots of lesbian and gay people, or my allegiance of these right-wing evangelical nationalists who are gonna keep me in power. And what's happening to liberal elites all over the world is that they are being forced to choose that. And I'd love for us to discuss what we do to force those of them who to make the choice to the progressive side to make that choice, because that moment is coming all over the world.
Talk about a little bit more about Europe, because that's the political and economic framework we're dealing with in France, and also because what has been happening in Italy and in Greece over the past decade has had an impact on the left and what we're doing now. So I think the point in Europe is that as Paul said, the European Union is in crisis because for a long time there was a cohesion about the neoliberal strategy, and they went on it, and the European Union was the most neoliberal of all, even more than the US on many aspects. And then the 2008 crisis happened, and then Greece collapsed, and Italy and Spain and the very deep economic crisis that started to put those in power against each other, especially due to the strategy of the strongest economy in Europe, in the EU, which is Germany, and the fact that they have the control of the money and the banks. So it started to really tense the strategy of the cohesion of the European ruling classes, and what we have now, and you can just like you said. Right now, you have somebody like Macron, the French president, who presents himself as the opposite of Orban in Hungary or Salvini in Italy. But they're really just like the two faces of the same coin. It's just like Salvini and Orban have a very xenophobic, anti-migrant rhetorics, but they are just as neoliberal as Macron, and they are just like different sides of their own ruling classes fighting to know what to do next. So to me, that's where France and has been the French ruling class has found its own has tried to rebrand itself and to try to go through its neoliberal agenda through Macron. There's nothing really new with Emmanuel Macron. Is kind of, I would say that he's kind of late in the game. It's like is been trying to do what Tony Blair did in the UK like 10, 15 years ago, or what Schröder did in Germany also 20 years ago. So there's nothing new, there's nothing revolutionary about him. He's just applying the neoliberal agenda that has been decided in the European Commission, and with more brutality than any other. And they have rebranded their neoliberal agenda with the face of a young man and with this plastic smile, but it's just so old as neoliberalism. And what it's been able to do is to tap into the resentment of the people and the need for something new, the need to change from the whole establishment, because we've had the Socialist Party in government for the past 5 years, and then before them you had the right-wing neoliberal in power, and they've been just alternating in power over the past 20 years, but always conducting the same neoliberal policies. And so there was this, what we call dégagisme, is like what happened in a lot of countries where people just were fed up and wanted a change, something to change even if it was just superficial or just the face of the people in power. So I think he managed to tap into that, and because of a series of different circumstances, he managed to be the frontman for the ruling class. So this is Macron a year ago being elected as a president, but now what we witnessed, and I think a lot of people, even those who because Emmanuel Macron was a member of the Socialist Party, he was in power with Hollande, so he is part of the establishment. He's not an outsider. And what was very striking from the start is that the new government he put together had only right-wing people from the right-wing party joined him. The prime minister, the economy minister, all the strongest ministers were held by and are held by right-wing people, and he went directly to attack the labor movement with his reform of the labor rights. He went on with a bill about a law about terrorism, and then he had he pushed for a bill about migrant issues. So all his politics has been pro-rich and against the poor, and that really showed that the so-called center is not the center. It's just extreme finance, and they are ready and they are willing even to pander to the far right. What we witnessed when we debated about the new migrant law reform, that was totally not needed, because there was a previous one only a year ago that had been voted by the previous government, which was very anti-migrant and already very nasty. So he decided to have this new anti-migrant law, and just all the rhetorics was the rhetorics from the extreme right and from the far right, and they just gave the far right and Marine Le Pen and her party just free rein, using the very same words, talk about migrants, telling how migrants were doing benchmarking to decide which European country they would go, and that was really appalling. And a lot of people coming from the liberal left, coming from the Socialist Party, just discovered that they had voted for an anti-migrant president. So that was the most striking example of how that so-called center that presents itself as the opposite to the far right in Europe is actually doing the work of the far right in France and in Europe, because on that level also, Emmanuel Macron has been trying to be the leading man in Europe and be on the offensive, but they actually when the last European summit, about when they discuss especially migrant issues, they just agreed to what Orban and Salvini were pushing for, organizing center in third world countries to ban migrants to move, and all the main argument from Salvini and Urban were just like agreed by Macron and Merkel. So that's where we are now, and that's the many challenge the left has to face regarding the actual government.
You want to know what the most like annoying thing is? This one on? Like the most annoying thing about Macron is that since the existence of Macron, it means that any passably good-looking or well-groomed white guy in a suit in Britain is hailed as like, is this the new Macron? It's so annoying, and it's usually just some like quite clapped, like sideways-looking white dude who looks like he struggles with Velcro shoes, and it's like, is this the new Macron? And I think that's, I mean, it's not just something to deride, it's something to understand, right? Which is the fantasy of liberalism after 2008, which is the prevailing mood in like British establishment media is one of, at some point the grown-ups are going to come back and take it back to how it was, in the heady glory days of 2014, where nothing bad ever happened. And I think like Macron as a symbol of that is, well, it depends who you talk to. I think like, a potent image in some circles, a laughable one in others, because then you just have to look at the polling and how unpopular he is and be like, do you really want this? But that's a little bit off topic. I just wanted to share that with the group of how much it annoys me. I mean, what can I say about Britain that hasn't already been touched on? I think maybe something I'd like to talk about is the way in which racism has transformed. And this is a project which predates the 2008 financial crash. I think that we have to look at the transformations of racism in the UK. I mean, I'm not going to start in 1492 because I've realised that we'd be pushed for time. So maybe let's have a look around the 1980s. Because when Thatcher was in power, and I would say that this was the case right up to like 1985, a bit later, is that you did have an anti-racist movement which was effective in the UK. My mum was part of it. My grandma was part of it. Now, there were huge problems with it. This was when kind of out of the trade union movements, you have this notion of political blackness, which has been widely discredited, but to its credit, could actually get people together in a room and get people working on things. And you also had, up and down the country, large-scale urban uprisings. So the most famous ones, you had the Brixton riots, you had Broadwater Farm, which is one that my family was involved in Tottenham in North London. You had Toxteth, you had Handsworth. Often, this was prompted by an act of police violence. In the case of Broadwater Farm, it was when Cynthia Jarrett was killed during a raid on her home. But it also had a lot to do with the immiserating conditions of neoliberalism. The left tells a history of the pushback against neoliberalism, which is quite literally whitewashed, right? We talk about the miners' strike, we talk about, steelworker strike, we talk about the print strike. We never include in our understanding of this history these urban uprisings, which have been subsequently termed race riots, but, white people were involved as well. It wasn't just, Afro-Caribbean youth, it was also Asian youth involved in these uprisings as well. And the response to this by the state was interesting because there were two conflicting opinions. You had the opinion of Oliver Letwin, one of Margaret Thatcher's chief advisors at the time, her policy advisor, saying, just ignore them and hope that they essentially die slowly in these forgotten corners of urban centres. But then you had figures like Lord Scarman who prevailed ultimately, who said, no, what you need to do is, in order to mitigate the effectiveness of these anti-racist movements, these urban uprisings, you need to create a sense of buy-in on the part of people of colour in the country. How do you do that? Do you build adequate housing, improve access to healthcare, to education, quality employment, better pay? Do you stop the police being so fucking racist all the time? No. What you need is brown faces in high places. So the findings of the Scarman report recommended that you grow the budget of, I think, what was called the Urban Projects budget 4 projects of representation. And this is kind of, the seedlings which really grew under New Labour of Quango culture, NGO culture, all these committees, you don't know what the fuck they're for, which are supposedly for improving the lives of people of colour. And king of the Quango and was the guy called Trevor Phillips, right? Who's, looks like, he'd present children's television, kind of unassuming, glasses. And he was king of state multiculturalism, which was all about if only you improve aspiration amongst particularly black people, you will have a project of, the withering away of racism. And during this time period, under New Labour, there were some significant what felt like wins. So in the early 90s, a young black man called Stephen Lawrence was murdered by racists. It took nearly 20 years for anyone to see jail time for it. And there was a police cover-up because the police were closely linked with this criminal family who, the sons of whom had participated in the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. So in 1999, you've got what's called the McPherson Report. And the McPherson Report has been remembered as much more radical than it was, right? It's one of those things where everyone invokes the McPherson Report, no one's bloody read it. But actually what it did was take some of the language of the anti-racist movements from the 1980s, which had withered away because of the state multiculturalism project, and said that what we have in the Metropolitan Police is institutional racism. And that felt like a win that was significant at the time. I remember, even though I was a kid, I remember my mum talking about it. But this phrase institutional racism was only dominant within New Labour for about 3 years, because then Home Secretary David Blunkett basically chucked it out the window in a speech. He says, this slogan, institutional racism, misses the point. It's about individuals. And around this time, you see a kind of sharp rightwards tack on issues around race, immigration, and belonging by New Labour, which had presented itself as the party of diversity, because I think there was, one black lady in it or something, and, cosmopolitanism and all the rest of it. And this, double-facedness has always been in the New Labour project. They brought through the Race Relations Act 2000, but they made exempt from the Race Relations Act immigration officers. So you could racially discriminate if you're an immigration officer. It called open season on Tamils, Afghans, Somalis, Romanian Roma as well, and kind of set the blueprint for what would become the hostile environment immigration policy under David Cameron and then Theresa May. But after this slogan, institutional racism, gets chucked out the window, you have this sharp rightwards tack. The BNP, a far-right party, was, doing what UKIP was kind of doing now, which is, coming close second, particularly in the white flight ring around London, which seems to me to be nothing but big Tesco's and shopping centres, but apparently people live there too. And in order to chase this vote, New Labour went absolutely ham on the asylum issue. Right? Asylum seekers everywhere, claiming benefits and stealing your jobs, but also simultaneously not working. Asylum seekers everywhere, right? If there's an abandoned fridge at the bottom of your road, there are asylum seekers living in there. It was, this crazy moral panic, which emboldened the BNP. It made them do really well. And I was reading an interview with the BNP councillor at the time. He said, look, we went around knocking on doors with the luxury of knowing we were talking about the mainstream issue of the day, which is asylum seekers. Another great interview that I read was with a resident in a place called Broxbourne, which truly is a godforsaken place. It's proper suburbia, curtain twitching territory. So, I'm not sure if the show Keeping Up Appearances ever made it over here, but Hyacinth Bucket twitching the kind of scratchy net curtains, that's Broxbourne. And so there's an interview with a woman called Maureen Brownless, who was a resident. She was like, oh, you know what I'm sick of? I'm sick of all these asylum seekers. I see them in the post office every week, collecting their benefits. Why should they get benefits? And this reporter then went back and looked it up, and there was not a single asylum seeker living in Broxbourne. All that happened was that she'd seen some brown people and completely lost her shit. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because this is a really important point to make, is that the far right did not invade mainstream politics, right? It did not invade the liberal centre. It was spawned and emboldened by the liberal centre the whole way. And the thing about the liberal centre is that it's always going to lose on that terrain, because at some point people are going, wait, hang on whose watch is all this bad stuff happening? Why are all these migrants coming over? And at the same time as you've got this process, which, Sivanandan would call, xeno-racism, that's the phenomenon of the twinning together of anxieties around, the integrity of borders and also, notions of racial purity. You've got the war on terror. And this is really significant for thinking about how it built on racialized anxieties around, Commonwealth migrants, i.e. post-colonial migrants, particularly from the Indian subcontinent. Because you had a deniable form of racism. And the reason why I invoke Trevor Phillips is because this is something that he said, listen, Muslims are never going to do what black people did. Black people assimilated, and they could assimilate, because obviously it's wrong to discriminate on people based on the color of their skin. But Muslims, how can you assimilate a culture which is an existential threat to Britain? You can't. So what you had with the war on terror wasn't just the hypervisibility of Muslims, and also hypervisibility in lots of ways. If you're a Muslim, you're not just racialized as a terrorist. Particularly in the last 5 years or so, you've got this, spectre of the Muslim paedophile, particularly in deindustrialized Midlands and northern areas. This idea of the Pakistani grooming gang. It's become a truism which has been uttered by some parts of the left as well. It's a really difficult form of racism to dislodge. But yeah, the hypervisibility of Muslims is a very, very effective technology of governance, because you have a swath of anxieties which can have buy-in from communities of colour and working class communities of colour as well. So you have a form of racism which is essentially kaleidoscopic, which is malleable. You've got a British nativism which can tactically incorporate, not just black people, but, Gujarati Hindus living around Leicester, or, I'm sorry, I've just got beef with Gujarati Hindus because they don't feed you at weddings. This is an entirely different beef. Just the ones in Leicester, the rest of them are fine. I really should stop talking sometimes. Which can tactically incorporate these, immigrant communities or descendants of immigrant communities, and can appear as a kind of, deracinated form of racism. That plausible deniability, I think, will become harder to maintain as we go through Brexit. And I'm no fan of the EU. I don't think that the EU is an anti-racist institution. I think it's founded on the principles of white supremacy, the idea of a white majority Europe and a pan-European identity predicated on the violent enforcement of borders for people particularly from Africa and particularly from the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. But I think that, as Brexit, which is supposed to be the promise of, returning to colonial heydays. I mean, literally, Liam Fox, who's a, senior conservative Brexiteer, said that post-Brexit trade deals would be Empire 2.0. These people are crazy. It's an impossible, an impossible fantasy. I think that plausibly deniable racism will become much harder to maintain because the country is changing. At some point, it will be majority-minority. The fastest growing demographic, not just Muslims, and that's because we make conversion really easy. We're literally like face it east, say an Arabic phrase, boom, done, is people of mixed heritage. And the most diverse communities are working class ones, right? The most segregated communities aren't white working class communities at all. It's white middle class communities. It's your hyacinth bucket curtain twitchers in Broxbourne. So even this story of who is it that drives racism? Who is feeling economically anxious and whose economic anxieties are translated into cultural ones is highly selective. And even the telling of the story, even the analysis, replicates the same conditions which produce the crisis that we find ourselves in. And it's completely toxic and corrosive to solidarity. I think maybe the thing that I would like to end on, because I think that this might be something we could discuss, is that the left has not built an adequate anti-racist movement in the UK. And I think that we can mobilize effectively here and there, but there's nothing sustainable and there's nothing that's redistributive in its analysis either. It's primarily a kind of cultural critique, right? We talk a lot about microaggressions, microaggressions. Well, the word micro is there for a reason. I think that we've lost our sense of priority. That's not to say that we reproduce a vulgar Marxism which goes, oh well, we should be talking about base and anything else is a distraction. No, I think that race and capital are co-constitutive, and we've had anti-colonial scholars who've been on this hype for 60 years. We've got the tools for that analysis. But what the left has not done is divest itself of lingering attachments to neoliberalism in how it conceives of anti-racist movements and organizing. What we do is identity politics, which I think is an anti-collectivist project. And what we need to rediscover is liberation politics, as imperfect as they are.
So I don't know how many of you are making connections, but my brain is spinning. My next question was moving along those lines. Ash, I think it's important for, we talked about that the fascist movement that is rising. And we see it from South America all the way, And so I think it's important to talk a little bit about what do we conceive the role of the left to be in fighting against that anti-fascist, fascist movement that's rising. And I have a second question to that. Like, in our development of politics, how do we develop movements that do not subsume to that neoliberal center-right type of politics that created the economic conditions in which we are now, right? And particularly when we engage in electoral politics. And so I know it's like heavy and we might not answer it in 3 minutes, but what do you all think about that? Easy peasy breezy.
Throwing us some real softball questions.
God. I want to start by reacting to what many things you said. Very interesting to me because as I got into politics, as I was telling earlier, I remember watching and talking with British activists during the start and the development of the anti-war movement, and how inspiring it was, and especially how massive, and you had so many people from different backgrounds, especially Muslim people being in the movement, and with young Muslim women at the forefront. And I remember how impressive it was, and how it contrasted with the situation in France when it comes to the anti-racist movement. But the connection, I do agree with many things you said about the connection between the way the extreme center use racism and the dynamics between their politics, their economic politics, and the identity politics of the ruling class. In France, there were two major events in the past 20 years that showed the rise of the far right. The first one was in 2002 when Jean-Marie Le Pen, the head of the Front National, which is the historically biggest far right movement, that got to the second round of the presidential election, which is the major election in France where the most people actually go and vote, because as in other countries, there's a lot of abstention in most of the election, except from the presidential election. So you had this, it was a major trauma for the country on many levels, especially because it was at the time a 3 years period where there was actually a socialist party government at the time who made some positive reform in terms of working hours and a few things like that. And there was even a little bit of economic prosperity, economic growth at the time during the Jospin government. So it came as a big shock that Jean-Marie Le Pen was at the second round of the presidential election. He got beaten by 80% voted for Jacques Chirac, who was the right-wing candidate at the time. And you had all in the media and all the liberal politicians saying that never again, it shouldn't happen ever again. Then again, in 2017, you had Marine Le Pen, who is the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, the head of their party, which is like a family business. It's actually is a family business, the Front National for the Le Pen family. So she came second. She came second at the presidential election last year against Emmanuel Macron, and then the disaster that everybody had been saying would never happen again, and just happened again that time. And the thing is, what is interesting is that this time Macron won, because I mean anybody would have won against Marine Le Pen, but by much less than not much less, but 20% less. He won by with 60% of the vote, and you had a lot of people, even people of color, saying that they couldn't vote for Macron because of what he stood for and what he represented, and all the decades of neoliberal policy and xenophobic policy and racist policies that the previous government, even the so-called left government of François Hollande, had been implementing in France. And there was a continuity between the Sarkozy government, the one who was there 10 years ago, and then the Hollande government. And so and one of the with the neoliberal policy and austerity they implemented in France, there was also the anti-migrant and racist policy that went through from, I mean, you could date it back to the start of the French Republic with the story of colonialism and slavery and so on and so forth. But it's one of the driving force that made the far right so strong in the polls. And even though they are not yet that organized into the street, it's like, as you said, it's not so much that they gone mainstream, that the mainstream shifted toward the right and the extreme right, and actually made their rhetorics mainstream and legitimate everything they were saying, especially about migrants being the reason for unemployment and fueling the fear of submersion, migrants submerging Europe and France. And actually the actual Home Minister, when we were debating the migrant law, actually said the word submersion, which was only used by the far right. So you got that, how the far right in France, which is most the main party that represented is Le Front National, which is now called, they rebranded themselves as the Rassemblement National. You got this new generation with Marine Le Pen that managed, not just last year, but the 5 years ago when she first stood in 2012 during the presidential election as the candidate of her party. She managed to rebrand herself and her party because she's a woman and she was a middle-aged blonde woman with not the same baggage that her father had, because her father was from the 50s and 60s, which has a very neo-fascist and neo-Nazi reputation. He used to be a torturer in Algeria during the Algerian War, and he was very close to that very extreme and very clearly fascist far right. And then she managed to rebrand herself in this like new fashion that happened in Europe, like more acceptable, more respectable far right. And then so she was the face of the far right, and you had in the media, and what's very striking, and how the media actually gave her a platform, and they were like crazy about her, and they actually helped her became acceptable for the people. And over the past year, the past couple of years, you had the new generation with Jean-Marie Le Pen's granddaughter. As I told you, it's a family business. And her name is Marion Maréchal Le Pen. And she's much younger, much blonder, and much prettier than her aunt, because she's her, the father, the daughter, and the daughter of another daughter. So it's all in the family. And so she's the one, and she got elected 5 years ago. Now she's not elected in the parliament, but she is literally presented of the new generations by all the media. The new generation, even when she doesn't do anything, they do a lot of articles about her. And what is interesting is that she's positioning herself quite differently from her aunt, because she's more closer to her grandfather kind of fascism. Like she's very close to all the identity far right, and with the Eastern Europe and Austrian far right, who the kind of people who do neo-Nazi balls and party and things like that. So she's a much more blatant fascist far right than her aunt, that tried to rebrand herself in a more acceptable way. So she's much more offensive. So this is the next generation that's we have to face. That's the story of the Le Pen family and their Front National business. But what's I want just to end with that. The point is, not only we were, as the left, unable to really fight against the far right because of the weakness of the anti-racist movement in France, but part of the left actually adopted some of the racism and racist rhetorics, especially when it comes to Muslim people. Just as he said, I mean, we could date it back to the colonial era, but especially since September 11, 17 years ago, Islamophobia spread in France and was became an acceptable form of racism, with also the aftermath of the terrorist attack in France in 2015 and then in 2016. It also focused on women, Muslim women, a lot. So part of the left really was very permeated by this rhetoric, and that's one of the I think that's one of the blind spots and the I wouldn't say main challenge, but one of the big challenge we have as a left, how we fight back, not just in terms of opposing neoliberal policies, but also how we builds a genuine anti-racist movement with the very people who are attacked, which means black and brown people, people of color, and Muslim people in France, who are now the main target of the far right, but also of the extreme center and the Macron government.
Thank you. I want to come at it as a slightly different angle and look at sources that we could look at to understand what's going on with what you might call xenophobic nationalism, alt-right intelligentsia, and the traditional neo-Nazis, which is how I segment the three. Now, one place not to look is academia, and it's unfortunate because there is a big study in sociology and social psychology of the far right, but it's all 10 to 15 years out of date. The debate within that academia is what causes it. Is it economic insecurity or is it immigration? That's the basic debate. Now, I think it's fairly clear that in addition to immigration or ethnic diversity, it is also violent misogyny. And you see it especially here in America. So what they tend to find when they do the surveys is what drives the actual hard right neo-Nazis, people who put on a swastika and do the swastika salute, in Europe, is economic deprivation. But what has driven this wider and more mainstream movement like UKIP, like the AFD, like Le Front National, has been hostility to migration and to cultural diversity. That's what is fairly clear is what winds people up. Now, however, since Trump, since the AFD, since Pegida in Germany, this big far-right movement, I think the missing third thing that the academics haven't got around to studying is the third thing that causes it is fascists being in power. In localities, in towns, in cities, in the White House. Rich Higgins, who put this memo on Trump's desk, full of the same language as in Andres Breivik's 1,000-page manifesto, the guy who killed 90 people in Norway, the fascist murderer. The language is the same. Now, by being in power, the dynamic has now changed. And for us fighting it, I think so number one, academics need to go back and do more work, but in the meantime, there's a dynamic now. And on a good, what's the next source? Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is actually very good on the dynamics of how fascist movement. I think she's terrible on understanding where Stalinism came from, but in fact, the Trotskyists she despised in this city were better at understanding that. Even James Burnham was better at understanding what was going on than Arendt. But on fascism, she describes it very well. And you probably have heard this phrase that she used. Fascism is an alliance of the elite and the mob. She actually said a temporary alliance of elite and mob. But the end of the sentence is, who need access to history, even at the price of destruction. Now, if you take that apart, it's a very good starting point for understanding what's going on. The elite, who needs the mob? 2009, Peter Thiel, the PayPal millionaire, writes this essay in which he says, I no longer believe freedom and democracy are compatible. That's economic freedom for him, Peter Thiel, and the Silicon Valley millionaires, are not compatible with democracy in America, because Americans are going to keep on voting, to bail out banks and to give fiscal stimuluses under Obama, meager though that was. So then you've got the second part of the thought architecture is put into place by this crazy Curtis Yarvin, the blogger, Mencius Moldbug. He writes these meandering essays, the point of which is we need monarchies, family-run states where the family is allowed to enrich itself at the price of order, like in Singapore, is what we need. Is it a surprise to you that 10 years later a family is in power in the White House, that is enriching itself? No, the thought architecture of the new alliance between the elite and mob is the idea that we need to get rid of the democracy part of capitalism because it's not compatible with the neoliberal part. That's what they're doing. Now, to do that, you've got these benighted people, liberals, they sit around thinking they live in a liberal democracy. Oh, look, there's a lovely organizing place on 37th West. They like that. Even if they don't want to come here, they love it. But Curtis Yarvin and Thiel and co. and Richard Spencer have a united interest, and their equivalents in our countries all have a united interest in there not being a liberal democracy. So, but then there's the bit that Arendt writes, access to history, and I think it's very important. She wrote about in the 30s the people in Germany of the elite and the masses who followed them had an equal interest in reversing, like almost like on an old tape recorder, pressing the rewind button on history, because she pointed out that the old Prussian Junker aristocracy was going to be demolished by modernity, and so were, the old Christian conservative working class. They were surrounded by the Weimar Republic. The movie Cabaret is based on reality. They could go to clubs like that, but they didn't want to. They wanted those clubs to be turned into what the Cabaret Club became was the local SS headquarters when it was smashed. Now, the alliance of elite and mob to rewind history is what we're seeing now. That's what we're seeing. And so to finish about that for me informs how we fight back. I think I do a lot of street, door knocking, talking to people who are, the material of this mob, to be quite frank. On a good day, they say, I don't care if my economy crashes and I lose my job, even as long as the migrants go away. On a good day, they say, okay, I hear what you're saying about all this, and I don't hate them as individually, but I just don't like my culture being polluted. Okay, well, those two are both bad things, but one of them you can work with, because you can then say, okay, we've got a thing that it's almost like with a little kid, you always go like, don't look at this shiny thing over here. Look, I have a bell. Look at this, listen to this bell. And the bell is, what if we turned up in your town that's been destroyed by neoliberalism, where there's no public life after 6 p.m, everything's quiet, no bars, no cafes. What if we turned up and opened something like this? What if we turned up and put the maternity ward back into the hospital? What if we, gave your kids free university tuition instead of it costing $9,000, and therefore you can't afford it? They do listen. Okay, now that doesn't mean all these colonially formed, often, layer upon layer, because the point that we should remember about neoliberalism, it had this weird football game attitude towards nationalism. It said, there's a global system and everybody shares in globalization. Globalization, ethnic diversity is wonderful, but we're still the greatest country in the world. And you always thought it's like my football team's the greatest football team in the world. It's in the 3rd division, but it's still the greatest football team in the world. See, we always thought they were joking, but the poor benighted white person on £12,000 a year, that's probably the only thing they really care about. Well, I've got fuck all, but I still live in the greatest country in the world. They believe it. Now, we should remember that dialogue has been planted there in their brains, and it is susceptible to argument. And therefore, this is where it leads me in terms of lessons to draw from the British experience to the experience here, and possibly in France, I think, is that although I accept the academic argument that the real thing that has driven the move to the right is both recent migration, obvious migration, the sort of cultural pollution, as the right put it, I accept that. My experience is, weirdly, that that addressing the economic insecurity is actually a very good way of distracting them from that issue. So, because you can't, as I say to colleagues in Labour, we cannot give an inch to our white, fellow working class people on the issues of culture and diversity. But we can offer an answer on the front of economics, and we should do that. And that is how I think we do begin to fight back. And my experience is when you do it, if you were prepared to do it in the language of there is a street fight. The street fights don't just go on between people's fists and boots. They go on at a level of language. And I find the British left, the American left, all lefts they find it quite difficult to find the language in which to engage those workers. And actually, for me, it's also an incremental thing. If I can stop an ethno-nationalist right-wing voter becoming a committed fascist. But this is what Arendt says. Look, the struggle by 1931 is to stop the Nazis coming to power. You know, that probably means keeping a right-wing government as bad as Trump in power. But if I can stop that, I will do it. But more importantly, if we can create a vibrant counter-movement, which is like lives in the bars and clubs and the pubs that they are in, and my friends do this in my hometown, they'll shout across the bar, fuck you, you're a Nazi, fuck you, you're a communist. They don't fight. If the counter-movement is there, brilliant. The moment the counter-movement isn't there, you've lost the battle. So our thing is to create the counterpower to them. But, you know, literally go through the 1930s. Germany, they did, and it failed. Austria, they did. You know, the Austrian workers' movement had 2 more fighter planes than the Austrian government. It was 2. At the moment, when the Austrian government smashed it and machine-gunned them all, in 1934, they lost. Spain, they didn't lose. They had to be invaded to lose because they fought back. Britain, we didn't lose. France, we didn't lose. So because of the 1934 unity between the communists and the socialists. So you win some, but you lose some. But that's where we are. On that cheery note.
I mean, I've just been looking at both of you like completely starry-eyed, I'm gonna have to I'm glad this is being recorded. I'm gonna have to watch this back because it's a lot to absorb. I mean, the wages of whiteness are paid in more than money, right? And we know this. And, you know, you talked about the kind of nihilism of racism. This bears out in some polling that I saw immediately after the Brexit result, is that of people that voted Brexit, there was extreme polarization between 30% of people who didn't want to sacrifice any of their household income to reduce immigration to 30% on the other side who would give up 5% of their household income to reduce immigration to 0. So, you know, even amongst those who want to see a reduction in immigration, there is, like I said, extreme polarization. And I think ultimately that's better for the left. Right? Maybe it's because I went to an all-girls school, but my favorite tactic for dealing with the far right is isolate and humiliate. And you need to get that 30%, right, who want to tank their own, you know, the word prosperity is the wrong one to use in the age of austerity, but, you know, want to tank what little that they have out of a sense of nihilism and vengeance. They're the ones who you need to isolate and humiliate. You make them make the argument that losing out in wages is better for you because you get this kind of, you know, this other payment of whiteness. Make them make that argument to other white people and see how far it goes. That only, of course, works if we present a leftist alternative. But I think we can't be complacent about this other appeal and this other allure. Forgive me if I speak haltingly about this because I'm still trying to work it out in my head. But I saw the allure of that particular kind of whiteness when I was growing up. So my mum was a single mum. She had me and my sister. My sister was always really lovely. I was always a bit of a handful. And next door to us, and you know, she was stressed as hell. She was a social worker, so she was working mad hours, and she had 2 kids under 10. Moved in next door to us was a white working class family. And it was probably the case that they thought we were snobs, we thought that they were racist, and it turns out we were both right. And in order to deal with what they saw as my mum's unearned sense of dignity, they resorted to ever more forms of debased behaviours in themselves just to prove that they were still better. Right, due to their whiteness, so they'd like piss all over the front door and like defecate like by the front door to watch my mum clean it up. They would put lit cigarettes through the like letterbox to try and set fire to the like letters below if they knew that that I was in the house or my sister was in the house and my mum wasn't because she was working, or the Chuck stuff. And my whole life after that, I bore such a grudge to anyone that spoke like them or had that mood. And I had this this anger and this rage, which I think lots of people of colour in this room understand, right? It's where you stop thinking about tactics and you stop thinking about coalitions and, you know, who can you work with and what conversations can you have. And whenever I came across that mood, I wanted to kick the shit out of someone. And that meant that I viewed the kinds of conversations that Paul's talking about having with an immense suspicion, if I'm honest. I looked at that as a capitulation. Why do you care about their feelings? You know, why do you want to get them on side? Like, don't you see what they do? And it's only in the last year and a half, really, that I've understood what it is we're trying to do and what those conversations are and what's at stake. Because I did some interviews in a place called Barking in East London, which was white flight ring. And then because of gentrification, the brown people started moving there too. And poor white folk are just like, oh shit, we moved here like out of Hackney because of you, and now you're here again. It's like, you know, surprise. And so Barking cut against most of London in that it voted for Brexit fairly heavily. And Barking's traditionally had quite a strong far-right presence. So a couple of weeks after the referendum result, I went around interviewing people. And I couldn't find a single white person that voted to remain. I couldn't find a single person of colour that voted to leave the EU. And I sat talking to a table of like working class white people, and there it was. There was that mood of, you know, I'll shit on your doorstep, basically. They were saying, you know, I was like, so why did you vote? Why did you vote for Brexit? And they said, look at all these Syrians coming over here, drowning themselves. Why can't they stay where they are? Why can't they stay and fight? And there was something in that phrase, drowning themselves, and the kind of glee with which that was said, like, you know, that's what you get for trying to come here. And I felt that rage again. I felt that bile. And because I felt that rage again, I didn't hear, or, you know, I heard, but I didn't hear what they said next. Because then it turns out everyone around that table supported Jeremy Corbyn. And I was like, but his approach to refugees is very different. And they went, oh, well, you can't agree with someone on anything. And it was very chilled. And at that time, I took that as, oh, this means that, Labour's always as racist as I thought they were. But actually, it was a tonic to that rage that I'd felt all my life, to realise that actually, you know, it's not just a bell that's tinkling over here or like, you know, the promise of jam tomorrow, that actually we can all agree that there needs to be an NHS, right? We can all agree that there needs to be more housing. The fight will come over distribution of that housing, of who has access to the NHS, but you will vote for a party that's providing those things and isn't capitulating on racism versus a party that's feeding your racism and not delivering anything else. I think that's a reason to be hopeful. The one thing that I would say, and this is territory that the left neglects, is that there are all these cultural spaces which don't have to be owned and dominated by these vengeful, nihilistic racists. And they don't have to be owned and occupied them if we stopped focusing on building, you know, this is the kind of, you know, the anarchist hangover that I think we all have. And I'm still an anarchist at heart. Like, you know, I love hummus and I hate the state, like, you know. But we have this, you know, hangover by which we think that if we can just make the right social space, make the right social network, the rest will fall into place. And there is no such thing as the perfect social network or the perfect social space, because let's face it, people are fucking awful. But you know, that's who we have to work with. Like that's the business of politics. Like, you know, I hate living in this flesh prison, and so do all of you. And the kinds of spaces that we need to occupy, because I know you talked about, you know, pubs and, you know, bars. I've been putting my fair shift in there, I can tell you that. But another one is like sports, right? Like, I'm a mad football fan, so like Tottenham Hotspur, my man. it's like the bad boyfriend of my life. Like, he hurts me and I keep going back and he says he's going to change and he never changes. You know, and this is something which the far right have cannily understood, is that the left looks at the kind of, you know, macho-ness of football culture, you know, the beeriness, the sweariness, the, you know, racism on the terraces, the, you know, going into the toilets at halftime to like do a line of hooter and then like have another lager, and looks at that with a mixture of fear and disdain. I look at some of that and feel like, oh, that's a good weekend. And the far right in the UK have that space. They have that space. They own that space. The one place where they don't, and to my shame, the head of a far-right street movement, which is incredibly violent, called the Football Lads Alliance, is a Tottenham fan, and I take that as a personal slight. The one place which is the exception to this is in Liverpool, where you've got two football teams. You've got Liverpool, you've got Everton, and through like supporters networks, they've organised food bank collections, and they then distribute that food through local mosques. So here you've got, I think, like a perfect example of like, well, how do you turn fighting fascism into an everyday activity? Not just, you know, how do you do mass mobilizations to like, you know, kick some heads in? I do also believe in kicking in some heads, but you know, the problem with if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. Like, actually, you know, you are trying to win people over. You are trying to disabuse people of the notion that, you know, that immaterial wage of whiteness is worth something, right? That means you have to do these other projects. And I think that, you know, the Fan Supporting Food Banks project has got it just right. It takes that space of, you know, working class culture that the left is often viewed with disdain because we skipped PE, like, you know, the whole time while we were at school. It shows that mosques aren't these terrifying closed off spaces, and it ameliorates some of the worst effects of austerity now. Because Corbyn is the promise of jam tomorrow. Not everyone can wait for jam tomorrow when they can't afford to feed their kids today. And it's an indictment of the left that we don't think about our neighborhoods as worthwhile spaces to organize, right? We would rather do it on Twitter. We'd rather, like, you know, quote tweet some dumb fascist and, you know, get, like, you know, do numbers on that, rather than thinking about how do we break up this, you know, how do we break down this psychological segregation of the left and everyone else, the left and working class culture, and, you know, the psychological segregation between working class communities of color and working class white people. Because in the UK, we don't have monocultures in the same way as you do in the States. Like, here, things are much more racially segregated. Like, my childhood is the representative one. I'm living next door to a racist. They're not in the next town. They're in the next house, because, you know, we don't have racialized monocultures in the same way, and we don't look at these points of social contact as a legitimate terrain for politics. In fact, we sort of, as the left, as radical as we think we are, embody some of that liberal fantasy of thinking that the answer lies with producing more cloisters than it is in getting on the terraces. So yeah, basically I'm saying, like, you know, support Tottenham Hotspur, fight fascism. Yeah. Did you say Arsenal? Because I was going to say, I will fight you.
Hold it back.
Yeah, just like back.
Sorry, I wanted to react to some things you said, many great things, because it reminded me of two separate experiences that I had and that shows, I mean, at the same time, the confusion there is in a lot of people's head, but also the line we have to keep, and how we have to rebuild an hegemony in the society, and what you said about the psychological space and stuff like that. Because during the presidential campaign, I think one of the best meeting I had was in a town in France named Calais, which is on the near the channel on the coast, and it's a town that is known mostly in France because of the number of migrant people who's been living in encampment around the town for years because they want to cross to Britain, and they were barred from crossing, and so they've been it's been forever, like for 20 years now, and so the only thing we know about Calais is migrant encampments and very hard situation. So we had this meeting in this small restaurant in Calais, and we had a discussion about what we were standing for and discussing with people. And then after the meeting, we started talking with the manager of this place, and who by the end of the night, he just told me he was very surprised. He was very glad to have hosted in this place and to have allowed us to be there, because he was surprised of what we were saying, and that we were talking about working class issues, and we were really offensive in that. And it was that this restaurant was very in a very difficult situation because of the not just the migrant and the reputation of the place, but because there was a lot of policemen around, and so it was terrible for business, and so he had a lot of loans on that restaurant. So it was the typical working class, and he used to be a working class man. Then he got indebted to buy this restaurant. So I think you can picture the case, and so it was very friendly. We really had a good discussion and political discussion talking about that, and he asked me about what do I think about migrants. It was like a dare that to see what I was saying. So I said well, I think the situation is terrible for them first, and the whole situation and stuff like that. And by the end of the day, the night, was saying, okay, I get where you're going, and so, and after we left, the comrades that was there actually told me that was a man who used to be a Front National voter, and he had voted for Marine Le Pen, and they started to hang out at that place and organize a meeting with them, and they saw he had this back room and that he could do a lot of things, so they started to do things with them, and they were really impressed by the discussion we had after, and they really said it's important because it shows that we managed to mix political discussion with finding a place where we could organize other things, and that's the way we want to build. And I was very struck by that moment, and it was a very touching, moving moment, because even I, as a Parisian, I came to Calais with the idea of this town and all those racist people, and it was very moving. And I'm going very quick now, but and then a year later, now I'm in the National Assembly, and we're working very late. So that's for the very first time in my life, I'm taking a taxi to go back to my place. It's really unsettling for the first time, and so this the driver was middle-aged man from Arabic descent. And we started to talk. And the thing in Paris that the taxi driver are facing the competition of Uber and all those app-related driving company. And they had been on strike and been mobilized for that. And we had a comrade of us who is also a town councillor, who's been very involved and very vocal in supporting them for some time now. So she's very well known. And we started to talk, and he said, "Oh, I saw you're an MP and you are with Mélenchon, and it's really important." And at some point, he told me that that he was fed up with everything, and that's one of the reasons why he voted for Marine Le Pen. And he just like said that, and he said, "No, not because of what she said about racism, but because I want just to say fuck off to the system." And I was so angry, and that was like a warning he was giving to the power that be in the system. And he was like also he said he voted for Mélenchon at the first round, and he voted for Marine Le Pen at the second round of the presidential election. And so we ended up, and I didn't very reacted when he told me that, but we talk about how it was important to fight back and support the movement like them, and also about the even the migrant issue wasn't about migrant but about the politics and stuff. So, and I was thinking about that when we talk about your experience, because I think a couple of years ago I wouldn't have been able to connect with either of those two persons because maybe being a little bit of a leftist, the idea that somebody who would vote for the far right and for Marine Le Pen was just racist, and that you have to fight them onto the street, and even though and even without that, I wouldn't have been able to know how to talk with them and to talk politically with those kind of people. I think we still have to fight back, and even when needed, to fight back onto the street, because we also have a brand of active fascist member, like the one who went in the Alps to prevent migrant people for crossing the border. They actually went there physically, and the government let them do, and so they can be very aggressive. A couple of days ago, we were not really celebrating, but it was the anniversary of the death of a comrade of us called Clément Méric, who was killed by fascist group, far right group. So there are still a danger, and every time we had debates in the National Assembly, and you have Marine Le Pen decide to show up, because she doesn't come every day, but when it's needed, which means when we talk about migrant issue or terrorism, she's there and she speaks, and we just want to even physically remove her from there, because it's such a nightmare. So yeah, fascism is real and alive, and it has to be fought with the clear and frontal and unbreakable mind, because they are a real danger. And on the one hand, and also on the other hand, everything you said about how we gain back and how we enter those spaces, working class and people's spaces, where we can, on the one hand, rebuild resistance against, the closure of an hospital, or what we've been trying to do in La France Insoumise, for instance, when garbage are not collected by the city, because in places like Marseille, there are really neighborhoods that are abandoned by the public services and stuff. And what we've started to do is to organize with the people to say, okay, we're going to clean the street and stuff like that. Maybe here, I think it's more of a tradition of community organizing and stuff, but in France, it's quite new, this way of doing, because we got a little bit complacent, because we used to have this strong, organized left with the trade unions, with the Communist Party and stuff, and we lost, I mean, those daily and even mundane way of organizing, as you said. So you have to do that, and in that process, I think that's the way you can fight back and convince people on your basis, not just to pander to their racism, but because you earn their trust and you won small victories on different issues, then fight back against fascism.
So we want to open the floor for some questions and exchange. Sierra's gonna help to move the mic around for folks that want to engage. I see a hand right there. And then the button.
Okay, I'll start over here. Thanks. First off, is this working? Thanks to all of you. I was really excited when I saw the list of panelists, and you really delivered, so thank you. But my question's for Paul, because I read your book last year, and one thing that really stuck with me, I guess, was I feel like it was in the introduction when you were talking about kind of the rise of neoliberalism and all, like how systematic it was, and how among the list of factors that you list, you kind of focus on the dismantling of labor unions as one of the main components of its rise. And so I was just wondering if you could speak about the role of organized labor in the UK currently, but also in the US if you can as well.
So I think when I was 30, I probably thought that the smashing of organised labour by neoliberalism was just another cycle in a long history. You know, I come from a part of Britain that has a 200-year history of first of all socialist republicanism and then trade unionism. That the republicanism came first, Jacobinism, and then trade unionism. But actually, I came to the conclusion it's not just a down; it's a decline. Neoliberalism has enforced the atomization of working class communities, and it's enforced the atomization of work to the point where I can remember work being something that was central to everybody's life, and now if you're a working class poor person, it's kind of a thing you do to keep yourself having a cell phone and a credit card. You know, there's no attempt to give it any meaning or nobility, as what our grandfathers would have thought of it. So we've still, despite that, got strong labour unions in the United Kingdom, but only in the public sector. We have a big public sector. Our healthcare, our education, our local services are all provided by the state, and they are unionised. So is the defence industry, because that's what you need partnership. You can't have instability. And so are niche parts of the industrial sector, but only say 19% of people are in those unions. So we have 7 million trade unionists. It's fair to say those 7 million trade unionists are quite to be in one is to be almost like an enemy of the people. As far as your boss is concerned. So you have to want to be in it. The other thing I'd say, and I think this probably chimes with everybody, there's a generational thing. As a union representative at the BBC, everybody who came into the department above the age of 35 said, "Where's my form? I need to make sure I transfer my membership to this branch so that I can be represented." Everybody under the age of 35 said, "I can't afford to join." And then we said, "But what about the pensions and the weekend?" And they said, "Well, yeah." And then usually about 6 months later, there would be a knock at the door, and they would say, "I didn't get a job I went for," or "Somebody harassed me. Can I join the union so that you can represent me? I won't stay in afterwards because I can't afford it." And we said, "Yeah, fine." So that's how we try and build trade unions like that. But I have ceased to believe that the main dynamic of the British struggle right now is that of industrial relations. It was when I was a kid, it was in my dad's generation, it was a cataclysmic struggle. That's what the miners' strike was to us. But now, what the unions are they're an important part of the coalition that has formed Corbynism, as we call Corbynism, the new radical left in Britain. But so is what you described as your emergent, that student movement. Think about this. Student movement, okay? Everybody suddenly gets told your degree now costs £27,000, not £9,000. And as it was put to me, remember in 1968, the students were seen as the detonator. Maybe the top 10% of, the most educated 10% of society went to university. In Britain, at the time when this was happening, although it's declined now, 50% of every generation went to college, went to university. So them exploding and going on the streets and going toe to toe with the riot police in a much tougher way. For example, in the exact same place, because I'm old and remember it, the miners went toe to toe with the riot police outside Westminster. Your riot was much fiercer and much more touch and go for the cops. So although I see the rise of neoliberalism as a total part of it was destruction of the power of organised labour. The fact that we still have organised labour is good. The fact that it's an educative and an organisation thing is good. But the dynamic is different. And come back to the concept, because one of the things I want that this centre, I think, has an ambition to be, is to be proudly theoretical, to talk about theories and not to let movements believe that we don't need theory. So I will introduce the name of the theorist, Mario Tronti, who was an Italian leftist, who said, we live in a social factory, that we're not just exploited anymore in the factory, it's everywhere. And so, yeah, that's my take on it. Now, what it means here, most of my contacts with the American left have been with organised labour, and there are some incredibly good trade unions and locales and locals where unionism, I think, is really strong and really progressive here, and good for that, including our colleagues in the journalism union. But right now, the weird thing is, in the West, everything's about government, everything's about state power. And what we ask in Momentum when we get our activists together, the first thing, I don't know whether you've been to one of these, but I was quite shocked as an ex-Marxist, old Marxist, to see this guy get all these activists around and say, who's serious in this room about taking state power? And a bunch of working class people, yeah, me, I am. And we never got asked that in the trade unions. It was who's serious about a pay rise. So, yeah.
Thank you. You four have been tremendous considering the weather that we've given y'all to come here. You guys have brought quite the sunshine here. My quick question was in regards to how we deal with having more independent left media, or I say just media for the people overall collectively, in terms of not having to go on, say, BBC, or you having to deal with Piers Morgan and embarrassing him, that whole factor. Oh, yeah, give a clap, give a clap. Didn't mean to give the shine, but it is what it is. So what did you guys take on that in terms of where you don't have to rely on going to, say, a BBC or a Del Spriegel or a Canal Plus, and being able to have people see that they are catering too much to just a far right or a centrist and not consistently to the issues and to the news of, say, everyday people that's going on that needs to be solved?
I mean, so I was having this argument with a self-identifying centrist journalist yesterday called Hugo Rifkind, which is the most centrist journalist name I've ever heard in my life. Like, hello, my name's Hugo Rifkind. It was a perfectly normal name. Because I was talking about what it is we try and do at Novara Media, because we're not the size that we want to be. But you have to have a growth strategy, I think, as a independent, unashamedly left-wing media outlet, which does have an engagement with precisely those outlets of the BBC, of Channel 4, of Canal Plus, or whatever. Because what you want to do is to dramatize the political conflict that you have with these outlets, right? What you want to do is have a moment on their terrain of taking the fight to them and saying, this is how you're shit and this is how you're lacking, which will drive traffic and interest to the thing that you've tried to build, where you then have the conversation on your own terms. And the thing is we were talking about how, the media love the far right. I don't think it's because of any ideological affinity. I think it's because producers are idiots. They're like sea lions who are just like clapping when a new ball is thrown in. And, so don't ever flatter yourself about why you're brought on, you know, as a leftist, it's not because you're brilliant, it's because you're a tap dancing poodle to them. And you know they're like, oh, she's just called, you know, Emily Maitlis a prick. That's good, isn't it? Like, you know, that's how producers think. You know, they are just like, you know, clapping sea lions. But their audience is far less stupid than they think they are. So you create the viral moment, you drive traffic to where you want it to be, and then you have the conversation you want to have, which is adventurous, you know, adventurous not just in terms of confrontational, but intellectually adventurous, intellectually rigorous, where you go, okay, right, like, you know, you're used to seeing, you know, Paul put up against, you know, some, you know, fucking idiot from, like, you know, the IEA or something. You know, what happens when Paul's being debated from the left, right? And so you start pushing the conversation in a more interesting direction. The tricky thing is when, because you can do analysis very well as a left media outlet, and you can do it, you know, there's no reason why you have to go super duper tabloid with it if you don't want to. Like, you know, I do believe that your audience is only as stupid as you treat them. So if you've got a good content strategy and you know, break things up and you don't do jargon for its own sake, but you can have, like, you know, complex ideas, I think that your audience will rise to meet the challenge, as long as you've got, like, multiple ways in. The trickier thing is, you know, because the establishment will let you have the terrain of analysis, because then that just means that you're another viewpoint, right? You're just a debating point. The thing that's much harder to shift is news and reporting itself. There are left-wing outlets that try and do, like, populist newsy stuff, and they tend to do very well. I don't know if it's because I'm a snob or if it's I have an instinctual like towards some of it, because I think they treat their audience as stupid. I think it's often very, very didactic in a way that's, you know, not very good. But I think that, you know, with the availability of technology that we have, when you look at, you know, the fact that, you know, Jacobin have now launched the Tribune in the UK, there's no reason why we can't grow the capacity to do really good reporting, to do really good investigative work, which, you know, investigations desks are, you know, shuttering across newspapers all over the world. You know, that there will be a hunger for that kind of work, and there's a political utility to doing that kind of work. What you need in order to achieve it is money, is, you know, time, is resources. That's the harder part. There are lots of different models for how you go about dealing with, like, getting money. I personally think we need to rediscover the tradition of left-wing bank robbery, but short of that, you know, I think that you can build up a subscriber-based model, which, you know, is driven by people that want your analysis and want these viral moments. And then you start, like, you know, shifting that towards expanding reporting and investigations capacity. So I realised that this is actually a really boring conversation where you're just like, so actually what you do with your funding streams is. But it's because I think it's important. Because the left is really good at having a critique of the media, and that critique of the media is often right. It's worse at building sustainable institutions. And I say that as, you know, someone who's part of a very unsustainable institution. Like, you know, Novara is, like, really held together on, like, spit, string, and shared delusion, right? And now we're trying to professionalize the whole thing and, you know, trying to put into practice in this thing of, like, you know, directing funding streams. But I think that this model of, you know, cultivating an audience, valuing your audience, treating them well, involving them in the conversation, and then using that to grow reporting capacity, there's no reason why you can't do that in other countries as well, in my opinion.
You about to have an Ocean 13 movie now.
Yeah. I watched Money Heist once, and now I'm just like, yeah, we should rob a bank.
You got some great ideas. So we have time for one more question, because we also want to allow folks to speak a little bit before we have to turn off the lights in the spot. So are there any other questions? We have a question back there.
Hey, thanks so much for being here. Ash, you talked about moving from an identity politics towards the politics of liberation. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit more. As you know, we live in a country that's based on centuries of division and violence. And so I guess maybe even all three of you could weigh in on this, but how do you create a space of encounter that acknowledges those histories and also can create a shared vision for moving forward?
I mean, I think the difference between identity politics and liberation politics is what terrain does it imagine racism or gender to exist on. And that's, you know, I speak a bit disparagingly of microaggressions, but it's just because inherent in that is an assumption that what it means to live without race is that we all get to live like white bourgeois people, which isn't living without race, right? That, you know, that subjectivity is produced by race itself. And so I think it's about moving from merely conceiving of anti-racism as something which, you know, regulates and interjects in our interpersonal lives into a confrontation with power itself. Because when you start, I think, confronting, the state apparatus, or when you start confronting capital, you realize that you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good anymore. You can only let the perfect be the enemy of the good in spaces of immense privilege. And so by that, you have to start dealing with the fact, like, you know what, we're probably not going to stamp out racism in our movement entirely. We're probably not going to stamp out misogyny in our movement entirely. But how much time do we want to dedicate to doing that, while also not neglecting the other work that we set out to do? And that's a much harder question, because there will be people whose instinct is go, we sacrifice no time, we put no effort into it, and that's obviously a shit proposition, right? And then there are those who will say, well, we can't do anything until we get our own house in order. And here's the thing, you'll never get your own house in order. You'll fix the radiator and then the roof will fall in. Like, you know, that's how it works. So I think that we need to, you know, conceive of that kind of movement building in a way which is strategic. And I'll give you an example of how the right weaponizes this instinct. Is that in the UK, there's currently a scandal engulfing the Labour Party, and the question that's being posed is just how anti-Semitic is the Labour Party? Now, my personal opinion is that because we've seen a growth in online activism, we also have woeful political education in this country. There's a kind of also this like miasma of anti-Semitism in the UK, which because we all think that, you know, Churchill, like, you know, knocked out Hitler single-handedly, that we don't have a tradition of anti-Semitism in this country, means that, you know, yes, there is like, you know, sharing of like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and, you know, racist memes and all the rest of it. But the right has been able to so effectively weaponize this against the left because, one, the left has an anti-racist conscience, right? Which when you prickle it, like, we will turn inwards and we'll be like, oh, fuck, are we the bad guys? That's really very effective. Two, there's some truth in it in the sense of, you know, you can identify, like, you know, a particular kind of left anti-Semitism, like, and three, because it is the kind of conception of racism which is fitting with, you know, 40 odd years of neoliberalism. Racism is about disposition, it's about sentiments, it's about, you know, how much do you hate a group of people rather than, you know, to what extent it is the society that we live in predicated on the abjection of a group of people. Because the minute you ask that question of anti-Semitism, which, don't get me wrong, affects people's lives, is deeply painful, you know, is growing in terms of attacks on synagogues and culturally observant Jewish people on the street, but it doesn't have a material component in the UK at this point in time. And then we have to do a difficult thing as leftists, which is we say, hang on, there isn't a hierarchy of racism in the sense of we don't value you as much, but there is a hierarchy of effects. And at some point, we do have to get on with the work that we set out to do, and we can't tear ourselves apart anymore over this. The tricky thing is that people go, aha, see, this is further evidence of your anti-Semitism, you see, right? But, you know, we have to say these difficult things. You know, as leftists, we try and get out of jail free card as lazy universalism, right? And we can't do that. There are political choices in front of us, and we do have to make them. Identity politics say that all things can be resolved by a universalism of either, you know, there is a perfection and we can achieve it and we will achieve it and we will do nothing else until we achieve it, or it says that, you know, these power dynamics are so ingrained and they are irreducible that there's no point in trying. Liberation politics says, like, well, fuck it, we've got to do something, like, we're dying here. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a pragmatism there, and for me that's the difference, but I'd love to hear from you guys on it.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me when there's discussion about identity politics, because we are so far behind in France when it comes to race relations and acknowledging racism in here. So identity politics, it doesn't exist as per se in France, because there this colorblind republicanism that exists within the left and within the society that prevented for a long time the left to really confront racism and not just confront, but acknowledge that the working class has always been mixed and diverse, and that it was enabled even to, I don't know if it's an achievement, but to understand the need for even token representation. It's like the French left is a white left, and when I say left, it's also as well political parties, but also trade unions and any space. And so it's interesting because all those discussions are happening at the same time that there's also in France movements, anti-racist movement. The anti-racist movement has been weakened by everything we talk about and racism and xenophobia and the far right for years now. But there's been movement to fight back, especially by younger generations of immigrant descent, what we call third generation or fourth generation now, or fifth, because I mean they are French. They were born in France, and so they don't refer to their grandparents' countries as their own, but because they are in France. But so you got this new generation that are being more vocal and who are demanding to be even included into French society and knowledge. And so it's a mixture of reformist rhetoric, in the sense that it means saying, okay, we just want to be part of the middle class, or we just want to be seen on the television, and at the same time, because of the way the French elite and establishment has been structured also around whiteness, even those demands are I wouldn't say subversive, but are really unable to be met by the French white ruling class. So it's to me there is it's not just in theory, but it's in practice. What has been really interesting in the past years in France is the movement against police violence. And especially one case about a young man named Adama Traoré, who's been killed by police 2 years ago now. And there's been a campaign since then by its family and friends and neighbors. And especially one of the spokesperson of this campaign is his sister, Assa Traoré. And she has been doing a great work at highlighting the over campaigns, because police brutality and racism in France has been going for years, and there have been a lot of young black or Arab people who have been killed, and now that's I think that's one of the first time when the left has become a little bit more involved in that, and so that's by building those campaigns, we build spaces where we actually fight together on one issue about that. We want to stop police violence and police brutality, and by doing that, we just we are working against both police violence, but also against what the French white left isolation from, people of color, and we are confronted to that, and I think that's with those unity campaign against those issues. As I said, I talked about the work we are trying to do in Marseille and in other places with community organizing in working class neighborhoods who are mixed or diverse, where there's a lot of working class people from every background, and to just organize and to do basic stuff like collecting clothes for kids or school pencil and stuff like that, and working with the people. Then we not only help and we are part of the rebuilding of community networks, but also we are actually in the process of changing ourselves, in the process of convincing people that will join us, and then we are getting more diverse and more ourselves. And I think this is the process by which we can fight back against that and go beyond just identity politics per se, but as you said, liberation politics.
All I can add to that is, I think, to try and understand the frame that the left has been getting wrong, or rather, it's not so much wrong, but it's proving ineffective. So centre-leftism frames like this: we're part of the elite, but we're the kind part. So we're going to do something for you, our poverty-stricken, friends in the working class. Okay, that's Blairism, that's Clintonism. Left populism. I mean, I don't like the word left populism, but from Syriza to Podemos to Corbyn, is really, look, we're all part of the oppressed, the masses, the working poor, and there's the elite, and we distrust them, and they hate us, and we're going to find a way of taking power away from them. The right frames it differently. It goes like this, and it's been doing it incidentally. It's not just Trump. The Southern strategy of the Republican Party from the 70s did it like this. It says this: there's the elite, here's you, the ordinary people, and the elite have these other people, the migrants, and they bring them in to attack you. That's the story of the Southern strategy, and it's the story of all far-right framing in Europe right now. Now, despite that, what is amazing is the number of times you described it. It's happened to me. In the last general election, you go to a shitty, heartland of xenophobia, and because of the radicalism of your politics, you get people, usually middle-aged white males, who are culturally important in their, which is good, culturally important in their community, come out of their house and said, all it took was for you to show that you meant it. They never said what it is, and I'm back. Give me a poster. These are guys who've been UKIP people, and they're back to Labour. Now, one part of you wants to go, oh, shit, there's no, because why did that end up like that? Why is it so easy for them to flip to this xenophobic right-wing politics and then flip back to us? But in another way, you have to then study it, because what all these three frames miss, elite mob migrants, is the individual story. And so for me, the thing my final retreat line is, let me tell you about why I'm here. What brought me to knock on your door today is this. And if you tell them your story and you listen to theirs, I think you have a beginnings of actually reframing it all beyond that. And I think that I keep thinking, the more I think about this, I keep thinking about that movie, Three Billboards. so many people will watch that, of whatever colour and of whatever nationality. It's gone down really well, I think, in general, in so many places, not because of the heroine, the protagonist, but the guy, the cop, the absolutely useless, dead ringer for a Trumpian Tea Party cop, is a redemption story for him. And actually that story is what we need to take so many people through to come back to a progressive politics. And the reason why we don't have the courage to do it, and often all the techniques to do it, is that we think of things as left and right and irredeemability. If you go on a fascist march, you are irredeemable. You're a fascist. But if you've thought about it and you've toyed with the fantasies behind it, and then you come back, then you're not irredeemable. And what it clearly shows is that their frame is different to our frame. Their frame is really, nobody gives a shit about me. My life is shit. How much more shit can it get if I leave Europe or vote for Trump? It's just like you're a guy. It's just a cry of despair. The moment you can show them a way that their cry of despair has a positive outcome for them, you're in business. And it's not about left and right anymore. But we are, we all come with our university degrees and our life experience and our Antifa work that we've all done, and then the street tells us another story. And I don't. That's not a theory. That's just an observation. But I don't think any of the theories currently about how left politics work really actually capture that very individual story, visceral, gut level connection thing. So it's an anti-theoretical point, really, in that sense.
So would you join me in thanking this amazing group of folks? And we've talked a lot, and I know it's late. And I like to chant. So sorry if you don't. But we shall chant now. And there's a chant that comes out of our struggles, understanding that, again, capitalism is a global ill that we need to attack globally. And one of the ways in which we do it is globalizing struggle and globalizing hope. And so call and response is very important in this matter of chanting. Would you agree? So let us stand up and flex.
Oh my God, you can flex my hand.
And I will say, globalize hope. Well, globalize struggle, and you will say, globalize hope. Can we do that? Yeah. Are we too tired to do that? No. We could get tired, but we must not abandon the ship of struggle. So, globalize struggle.
Globalize hope.
Oh my God, gracious. Are we really going to globalize struggle and hope? Globalize struggle.
Globalize hope.
Globalize struggle.
Globalize hope.
Globalize struggle.
Globalize hope.
We got to work a little bit more on the chanting piece, but we want to thank you for being here on a weekday and staying here till 9 actively. Welcome to the People's Forum. Check us out. Check us out. www.thepeoplesforum.org. #PeoplesForumNYZ. Yeah? Thank you so much. And get home safe.
Thank you for that. That was brilliant.
I could listen.